Hello and welcome to another edition of the OAuth Happy Hour. I'm Aaron Parecki.
Hello, everybody. Micah Silverman here.
Good to have you here joining us today. If you are joining us live, go ahead and say something in the chat so we know that you are here. And happy to take questions, of course, as normal throughout the day, but we're only here for like an hour. Yeah, I'm here in very smoky Portland, Oregon. The sky is bright orange right now, so that's kind of delightful.
I've seen some of the pictures. It's scary.
Yeah, it's pretty
It's
bad.
like Mars.
It looks like the apocalypse outside. So yeah, we're going to talk about all things OAuth today. Happy to answer questions that you might have. Also, we're just talking about online security in general. So yeah, great. And I see, oh, and by the way, we are also broadcasting on Twitch today. So if you are joining us on Twitch, hello to our Twitch viewers. First time doing that on this show. Where do you want to start, Micah?
That is always a good question. Anything new on the email list this week for OAuth?
Oh, well, I guess we had disclosure conference between our last stream and today, which went pretty well, and we both had talks there, which was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Your talk was fun. A demo of the talking all about browser extensions and how much power they have over things running in the browser.
Yeah, a little outside of OAuth, but I was able to get it posted both to the Google Web Store and the Mozilla Add-on Store, and its whole purpose is to show cat GIFs. But I asked for just about every permission possible, and it sailed on through Mozilla and took about a day. Now it took a few days for Google Chrome. But they're listed, they're live on the store. They don't do anything malicious. You can see the source code, but I kind of proved that they could.
Yeah, it doesn't take much to get those kinds of extensions listed, apparently, which is interesting. I feel like that's I don't know, maybe something that needs to be kept an eye on a little more closely, because once you're an extension, you have all sorts of powers to do pretty much anything in a browser. Whereas normally browsers are actually pretty well sandboxed environment. Like they're pretty good about isolating what websites can do to each other and how data can be accessed. So it's, yeah, a little bit scary that you can just completely bypass that by installing an extension.
Yeah. The vault on the front and wide open barn door on the back.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And how'd your talk go? I wasn't able to tune into it.
Yeah, my talk was a lot of fun. It was talking about all the new stuff in OAuth 2.1. So sort of giving an update on the state of that, which we talked about a lot of that stuff here before, about the new security recommendations that are coming through, about being more strict about things that the original spec was a little bit vague on. So it's coming along. There's still I'm still actually behind on the actual writing of that right now. I have a couple of I still need to look through some of the feedback we've been getting, but it's also other people are working on it right now, looking at it, giving feedback, doing a read through. So coming along. Hopefully should be able to make some more progress on that in a couple more weeks.
Nice.
But yeah, the talk went well. It's always nice to be able to share those kinds of updates about what the OAuth world is doing to make OAuth more secure. And it's, there's only so much we can do in the OAuth side of things around security to make that better, because it is a whole ecosystem, right? And that's actually one of the kind of a segue into one of the things I wanted to talk about today, which is how much security is wrapped up in the whole stack of the machine, from the squishy parts of your fingers and your brain all the way down to the hardware it's running on. and how difficult it actually is to protect that. And when we're talking about OAuth, we're talking about a very small slice of that, right? We're talking about like, how does an app running on your device get access to some API, some data in some API? And we can do the best possible thing, plug up all the holes in that mechanism, and your account can still be taken over at a different layer in the stack. So it's
Yeah,
it's a tough problem.
I get the question a lot. Well, what if you have a man in the middle, or what if your DNS is
Yeah.
compromised? All these types of like stack questions, and my answer is, well, you have bigger problems than OAuth. Then, OAuth in a lot of ways relies on the rest of your stack and your network infrastructure being whole and secure. So there are problems that OAuth can't save you from because they're at a different layer, or you just have bigger problems than OAuth if that gets compromised.
Yeah, there's a whole host of different ways an account can get compromised. And the act of logging in and typing in a password is just one of those, right? And using OAuth for like within a first party system, like Google is a good example where every Google app has to do an OAuth flow to Google. You don't go typing in your password into Gmail. That helps a lot, right? But your Google account can still be compromised in other ways. And now you got to layer on new things like make sure you have two-factor auth set up, right? Because otherwise someone can just steal a password. Or the thing that's been happening more and more now is actually just picking up session cookies out of a browser and dropping them into another browser. And then you're just logged in. You've just bypassed all authentication because the cookie was the result of that authentication, right? So
Yeah, that's a good example of where browser extensions can get you into trouble. I did a demonstration here about the authorization code injection attack using a browser extension, and kind of the key enabling factor there was, stealing a code in one browser, transmitting it to like a central hack server, and then peeling that off. And that was focused on OAuth, but you could do the same thing with session cookies or local storage, or if you have the ability to exfiltrate it, as they say, then it's kind of game over.
yeah, exactly. So yeah, I want to talk about this thing that's been happening a lot to Google accounts and specifically YouTube accounts. And this has been, I just keep seeing over and over again, I keep seeing these YouTube channels that essentially get taken over. And it happens to big name channels because those are the high value targets. So it'll be someone with 100,000 or more subscribers, and their YouTube channel will get taken over. And what the end result is, the attackers go and delete all of the videos on the account, rename the channel, rebrand the channel, and then start live streaming something. And typically it ends up being some sort of cryptocurrency scam, where just like the Twitter hack, where the goal of the scammers was to collect cryptocurrency by saying, send us 1,000 whatevers and we'll send you 2,000 back. They're never going to send you 2,000 back. They just want your 1,000, right? So there was this keeps happening on YouTube also, where someone with a large audience will get their channel taken over. A stream will start broadcasting saying exactly that. Of like, send your 1,000 whatever coin here, and I'll send you 2,000 back. And it boggles my mind how slow the process is to get that account restored. Like, it feels like it's a pretty clear cut case of this account was taken over. No one in their right mind is going to rebrand their completely unrelated channel in a day like that and start talking about a Bitcoin scam. But the fascinating thing is how this happens. And there's, of course, a number of ways to get access to somebody's YouTube account, right? YouTube is a Google account, so you need to get access to their Google account in order to do it. One of the ways involves OAuth, but that's actually not the most powerful way, because what OAuth apps can do on YouTube is limited. Like, there's a YouTube API, and if you go and grant some application the ability to manage your YouTube API, you actually are giving it a lot of power. You're giving it the ability to upload videos, delete videos, rename things, start live streams. But I don't think there's APIs for, I have to double check actually, but there's not like APIs for renaming your channel and things like that, because that's not something apps typically need to do. So you can do a lot of damage if you grant a malicious app access via OAuth, but it's not going to be a complete account takeover. Also, the recovery path that you have, if that happens, is you go to the account security page in Google and you revoke that app. Like it's actually pretty easy, and there's a lot of tools available for you to do that and recover yourself from that kind of takeover. That is very different from the case of the attacker was able to log in as you to Google and become you in Google. And that's where it starts getting, where they can start doing things like renaming your account, your channel, rebranding it, and more importantly, changing the password so that you can't get back into it, and changing the recovery email. So there's a number of ways that can happen. And you might be thinking, oh, well, two-factor auth, that's going to save me, right? And yeah, two-factor auth is good. You should set it up. Don't set up SMS two-factor, but a hardware-based or a app-based or a key, like a YubiKey or whatever, do that. However, that's not the end of the story. What that saves you from is if your password is stolen. So if you are reusing passwords and one website has their password database breached and the attacker is able to, try out these passwords on various services, they could end up trying your password on Google and get into your account. Now, a two-factor auth, especially something like a hardware-based, will stop that because it would require that they get access to that. Now, so that's great. Do that. That's an easy one to do, and it will stop that kind of attack. But it goes a lot deeper. So the particular thing that's happening with these YouTube channels is these are high value targets, right? They are large subscriber base, and they are targeted attacks. And protecting yourself from a targeted attack is very, very different than protecting yourself from broadcast or general attacks. Once you're being targeted because you have something of high value, whether it's a YouTube channel or a Bitcoin address or whatever it is, now attackers are going to try other things. And this is where it starts to get really sneaky. The most vulnerable piece in the puzzle around security is you, the user, because you can be tricked into doing things. So if, for example, the attacker can try to log in as you or try to do an account recovery flow is more common, and you have SMS set up where it's going to send you a code over SMS, the attacker might try some other way to communicate with you to trick you into sending that code to them so that they can then complete the recovery flow. So SMS is a phishable two-factor auth method. And that's one of the reasons why it's not a good idea to use it. One, it's phishable, but two, the worst part about SMS is that it's actually relatively easy for somebody else to socially engineer your cell phone provider into giving them your phone number. So you can just get your phone number taken over, and then the attacker can just respond to all the SMS challenges all day long. So SMS is terrible. Don't use it. Unphishable two-factor auth is what you want to go for, right? And that's going to be like the hardware keys, where there's no way for an attacker to use this, even if you try to allow it by tapping it on your computer. It's not going to be able to send them the right thing for them to use it. So that's a huge step up. Same with WebAuthn. So if your browser pops up the Face ID or Touch ID or the ones on the desktop, those are all unphishable second factor methods. So that's good. But again, there's still more attack vectors here. And even if you have two-factor auth set up, even if you're doing all these things right, using a unique password, at the end of the day, what is the result of logging into something? Well, in OAuth, it's the app gets an access token. And in just sort of general web, if you're talking about not necessarily an OAuth-based system, it'll be a session cookie, right? So you log into a website, you give the website your password, it gives you back a session cookie. You bring that session cookie back to the website and it knows who you are because it just issued that session cookie. And it doesn't matter what format that cookie's in, that has nothing to do with it. The fact is that whatever that string is represents that you're logged in. So if the attacker can steal that, then they can just go plug that into their browser, and then they're logged in as you. And because the cookie is the result of logging in, you've already done the hard part of typing in your password and going through the two-factor auth challenge. So that's a pretty big deal, right? So then the question is, how can someone steal a cookie? And there's a number of ways, one of which is browser extensions. If the browser extension can access all websites, all data across all websites, it could be stealing cookies and sending them somewhere. You have no idea, right? But another problem, and what is happening a lot, is desktop apps. If an app is running on your computer, it has access to your entire file system. And if it has access to your file system, it has access to where your browser stores cookies. See where this is going? So if the attacker can trick you into downloading an executable file, which you then run, it is trivial for it to take your entire cookie jar out of the browser and send it off somewhere. And now the attacker is logged in as you. So that's bad. So how do you prevent yourself from having this happen? Well, you can never run any program is the only way to prevent it. Never run any apps ever. Because apps can do anything, like once it's on your computer, right? I guess Mac OS with Catalina is changing that a little bit because apps are now having to ask for permission to access the file system, which I think is really interesting. So I've seen this pop up on my computer now more and more of, this app is trying to access this folder. Do you want to allow it? And that's actually trying to prevent that exact situation of apps having free reign over the file system, which is good. And on iOS, it's never, like, apps have never been able to communicate or access data from other apps ever. So that's great. iOS is very secure in that way. But how can you trick somebody into running a file? That's where it gets back to the squishy part of you sitting in front of the computer. People can be manipulated. And with enough motivation and with a high enough target, attackers are willing to spend a long time on that. So I'm not going to name names, but because this is still ongoing. But there's someone who yesterday had their YouTube account taken over because of this, and we chatted a bit, and I downloaded the file that caused this to check it out myself to see what was going on. I downloaded it onto a Ubuntu laptop that's essentially a throwaway, so I didn't want to risk, running any code myself, but I was able to open up the file and see what it was. And the process that the attacker used to do this was essentially they communicated with him saying, "Hey, we'd like you to review this product. Are you interested in getting, a free product or getting paid for whatever?" Some sort of typical, we want to work with you email from a well-known brand. And the email was from a Gmail account, which honestly isn't actually that uncommon in this industry. Typically, especially Chinese sellers will create Gmail accounts because they look more legitimate than the email providers that are typically used in China to people in the US. So you get an email from somebody with a Gmail account claiming to be from this company. Sounds legit. It's not that much of a red flag. And then they start emailing back and forth. They don't send you anything. They just start emailing you saying, "Hey, we want you to do this review," back and forth over a couple of weeks, right? So you develop this relationship with this person, thinking that you're talking to someone from this company. And eventually they're going to offer to send you the gear, whatever it is. And they may even actually send that to you, because it turns out that the value of this attack is worth a lot more than the $200 or whatever it takes to buy the whatever to ship it to you. They could just buy it from Amazon and ship it to you themselves because it's going to be worth it to them. And eventually the email says, All right, we want to make sure that you hit these certain talking points in the video. We've recorded a little video for you to watch so that you know what we're trying to communicate. And then this email contained a link to OneDrive, which is Microsoft's file sharing, legitimate site. A OneDrive link containing a zip file, which is, sure, you zip up a video file. It's not that unusual. 500 megabytes looks like a video file. So you download this file from Microsoft. Keep in mind, this is an email that this is somebody you've been emailing with for weeks, and there's zero sign of any sort of fishy behavior, right? So been emailing for weeks. You get this link to a video. Everything looks fine. It's a Microsoft OneDrive link. It's not some sketchy file service. You download it and open the file, and it looks like nothing happens. So you're like, well, that's weird. Try it again. Try it on a different computer. Nothing happens. What's going on? Well, it turns out the file was actually a file that ends in .scr, which is the old screensaver file format, which is essentially an exe file. So it's zipped up .scr. And that file is then able to, like, once you open it, it's running code on your computer. And as soon as you're running code, it can do whatever it wants. So on Windows, it can just go and find the cookie jar and ship that off somewhere. And who knows what else it's sending off, right? It could be sending your password manager's storage, which is probably encrypted, but sometimes they aren't. Like if you're using Chrome, I don't think Chrome stores them encrypted. So who knows what it's sending off, right? And so very soon what ended up happening was he started getting these notices of your password's been changed. Your two-factor auth method has been changed. Your recovery email has been changed because they were logged in as him. And that's even with two-factor auth set up. So pretty brutal. And it's really hard to protect against this. There's honestly like not a lot you can do, right? The problem was that running that file. So, don't open up. We're generally pretty well trained now to avoid opening files in attachments, right? Especially if it's the first time somebody sends you something. You're not just going to like open up an attachment from a random person. I think at this point, most people are pretty good about that. But if you've been emailing with this person for weeks and they send you a file that they say is a video, and then it's not, like, where's the red flag that's going to set you off there, right? I don't know. It's a tough one for sure.
Yeah, it's diabolical.
Yeah, social engineering at its finest, I think.
Yeah, a lot of effort was put into that.
A lot of effort, but the live stream
over weeks.
Yeah, weeks of communication. Who knows if they sent a product? I don't actually know if they did, but it wouldn't surprise me if they did, and it would be totally worth it. This stream had 50,000 viewers on it yesterday. I don't understand how they got that many, but it was a giveaway, whatever coin giveaway stream. So also, if you ever see anybody claiming that they're going to give you cryptocurrency, if you send them cryptocurrency, it's 100% a scam. Just don't do it. There's no excuse. Yeah. So my thought for you was write a browser extension to demonstrate this, right? Like it would be a pretty easy one to demonstrate, where one of the victim's extension picks up cookies from a domain, ships them somewhere, and then the attacker's extension would restore those cookies into the browser. If the APIs work that way. Otherwise, you have to just write a file onto disk or something. But be a fun demo.
Yeah,
of
I like it.
How easy it is to bypass all of the security measures we have in place. So what I was getting at with the specs and how this relates to the specs, like in OAuth, we can be doing everything right. We can be building the most secure OAuth flows. We can be using Parecki. We can have two-factor auth set up at the authorization server. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter because the end result of that is this application on your computer now has an access token which can be used to access the API. Right. So if that access token can be stolen from the device, which there are many ways to do it, as we're seeing more and more, it doesn't matter how good your OAuth was. So this is something that is actually like very much an active discussion item in the group right now. And there's several different attempts to solve it. There have been several attempts in the past. There's no good solution yet, is the problem. And one of the problems, or typically the only way to actually solve this is to use some sort of hardware security module, which has a key that cannot be extracted, and use that key to sign every request. So this is the idea of binding access tokens to something. And there's a couple different ways of doing this. One is mutual TLS. There's a new one being worked on called Depop. But they all work fundamentally the same, which is that there's a private key somewhere. And when an access token is issued, you have to prove that you control the private key, typically by signing a challenge. And then when you use the access token, you have to also sign that request with the private key. Now, that is only as secure as your private key storage method. So if you're storing your private key unencrypted on disk, same problem, right? You have to be storing it somewhere that is not accessible. And that's what these things do, right? There is no way to get the private key off of this device. I can tell this device to sign something by plugging in and tapping it, but I can't get the private key off. So there is no way to steal the credential off of this in order to be able to use it. And there is not a mechanism available in browsers to do that right now. The closest thing we have is WebAuthn, which does that one-off during an authentication flow, which again is good. It's better than nothing, because it's better than SMS two-factor auth because it's not phishable. But it doesn't help after the login flow. We now have the same problem of where we're just using a string that can be stolen to go and access data. So we need browsers to adopt something.
Yeah, it surprises me just how far the browsers have led, because it's not like there's that many of them. It's like Chrome, Firefox, Safari, and Edge now, I guess, which is really Chrome. And pretty much any laptop you buy today has some sort of biometric in it of varying quality, but something. So I don't know what the holdup has been compared to, like, say, mobile platforms.
Well, I mean, the same is true on mobile. Like it's not really something you can use reliably in every API request, right? It's because of the way the APIs are written, they're really meant for the one-time use during an authentication flow. Like if you got a Face ID prompt every time your app tried to make an API request, that would be ridiculous. So
that would be something. Yeah.
So the app needs some way to like unlock that and then be able to tell it to issue signed requests without prompting you every time until something changes, like you switch apps or whatever it is. And that really needs cooperation from down to the hardware level, because that is a hardware feature. And like, I guess like the A1 and A2 chips on Macs aren't that old. Like they're still relatively new. And there is something like that on Windows too, right? That's how Windows Hello works.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with it, but it's something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, some sort of hardware module that contains keys that can't be extracted. They can only be used. And so the hardware needs it. Then the OS needs it. Then the browser needs it. And then the website that you're accessing needs a way to verify it. So it has to go all the way up through that chain.
Right.
And we're just now getting it into the hardware layer, which is good. But we're not there yet.
The concern that I have, for the future of these things, which are great, is that at some point we're all going to get out into the world again. And if this becomes kind of like the way business is done, now you have this, physical thing, physical security problem all over again. Like a lot of companies now lock USB drives in their servers in closets. Well, if I'm in a hotel and, this is sticking out of my laptop and I step away if I'm careless, or if somebody, swaps it out. That's like a born identity thing, right? I mean, these things are pretty
Yeah,
ubiquitous. I wouldn't even know if somebody swapped it out, but now
it's a good
it's not like
point.
it's a fingerprint, it's just a contact.
They should sell them engraved so that you know if you're looking at yours or not.
Yeah.
Just get a Dremel
But,
and etch
I
my name
mean,
onto it.
right. I think to your point though, like there's no such thing as perfect security, and it's a cat and mouse game, and there'll always be something new, but we could definitely do better.
Yeah, but it's I mean it's the whole stack, and it has to be a cooperation across the whole stack, right? So the good news is that we are seeing progress on a lot of the different pieces, a lot of the different layers in the stack. So we're seeing these things become more common. They're getting integrated with more OSs. OSs are getting the equivalent of these built in, like to the phone, and it's good. It's progress, but it is slow, and it's frustrating that it is so easy to get completely taken over like that right now. Even when you think you're
Yep.
doing everything right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a concerted effort is the tough one. Like
Right. The targeted attacks, when you are being personally targeted for something, it is much harder to fight that.
yeah, indeed. Well, that's a good one. I'll definitely look into that and see what kind of trouble I can get into with some browser extensions.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, should we take a look at some of the questions? Here,
Yeah, we
well,
had a couple queuing up.
let's grab this last one, which is relevant to the current topic. Um, so closing the session at the authorization server will invalidate the access token, right? That's the idea, is if you can tell that you've been attacked, if you can tell that someone's been attacked, you need to invalidate the access token or the session or whatever it is. That's definitely a good idea to do it. The problem is, how do you tell if someone's been hacked, right? So that's where it starts to get a little bit more dicey. And the fact is that a access token by itself is right now all you need to make API requests. And unless you're doing heuristics around, is it being accessed from a similar looking IP, or do you no longer trust that this access token is valid because the IP is too different or something? Unless you're doing that kind of thing, the access token looks the same regardless of where it's being sent from, whether it's the attacker's machine or the real machine. But the problem is that like changing IP addresses is very normal. Like my cell phone hops IPs all the time as I move around cell towers, or I might even get on a plane someday and pop up in another country 2 hours later, right? So you can't even guarantee that just because the IP changed, it's an attack. Yeah.
I had another one in here on refresh tokens.
Yeah, this is a current discussion item in the OAuth group. So refresh token rotation, the idea is typically most services that have implemented refresh tokens will not issue a new one every time a refresh token is used. Like a refresh token usually has some lifetime, maybe unlimited, but maybe a week or a month or something, and it'll just be the same refresh token for that period of time, even if it's used again and again. The idea of refresh token rotation is that as soon as the refresh token is used once, it sends back a new refresh token to the app, and then that refresh token can't be used again. And that's a good way to detect replay attacks. And while we're talking about extracting strings out of devices, if someone was able to extract a refresh token, send it off to the attacker, and then both the real device and the attacker used it, then the authorization server knows there's a problem. And then it can shut everything down and block the attack, right? Because if it's supposed to be used only once, but it is used more than once, that means there was an attack, probably. So with that mechanism in place, the idea of sending refresh tokens to public clients becomes a lot better, right? It's a lot safer because we have more tools to detect problems. Refresh tokens with confidential clients, if there's a client secret, you generally assume that a client secret is secure and is the app's password, and the app developer is not going to let that leak, because it's easier to protect hardware that is under your own control. So you don't really need it for confidential clients, but for public clients, it's a great idea, because without it, it would be impossible to detect if a refresh token has been stolen and is now being used by an attacker. So it is, in fact, safe to return refresh tokens to public clients if they're rotating. And it's very common to do this in mobile apps, especially because all the things are in place for that to work. And refresh tokens in mobile apps make a lot of sense because the cost of logging in is so high. The usability cost of logging in is so high, of popping up the browser and interrupting your flow. Whereas in a web-based app, the cost of logging in is relatively low, because if you've got everything optimized, like in my demo apps I do in the workshops, I'm building an app, I click log in, I get redirected out to Okta and come back, and like it happens so fast that you can't even see it, right? In a mobile app, you're always going to see it. So with browser-based apps, the refresh tokens are still useful, but it's not as big of a deal if you had to do a page reload, right? But that said, this is still something that's up for discussion. One of the sort of counter arguments to refresh token rotation is that complex apps that may have like multiple threads or multiple processes may not be able to coordinate on using the refresh token. So if you have, like in a web browser, if you have the DOM doing something, also a service worker using the same access token refresh token pair to make requests, they can talk to each other, but they have to explicitly coordinate they're going to talk to each other, and they are running on different threads on the machine. So they may both end up trying to use the refresh token at the same time, unless you build in a link to make them coordinate that. And in that case, the one of those would fail and then would lock out the whole session, and the user have to log in again, which would be annoying. So same is true on mobile, where there's a UI thread
to that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in this refresh token rotation scenario, if let's just say I have two tabs open in a browser, and they're doing Pixie or whatever, and they each request, make that initial request to get an access token and refresh token. So would the second request, would a new refresh token coming back invalidate the previous one, even though it hadn't been used?
Are you talking about if both tabs are doing a Pixie flow?
Yeah. So it's separate requests. Each one gets a different authorization code. Each one exchanges the code for an access token. And in this example, they get back an access token and a refresh token. So now we have two refresh tokens, neither of which have been used in a world of refresh token rotation. Would they both still be completely valid, or does getting the second one automatically invalidate the first one, even though it hadn't been used?
So it totally depends on how the authorization server is deciding to handle this. But I would say the most common way that this would be handled is both of those authorization code exchanges result in completely different trees of tokens. So they're completely disconnected. They share a client ID, and that's about it. So there's an access token refresh token pair here, an access token refresh token pair here, and if this refresh token is used, then this refresh token is expired, like the old one's expired. But this one stays the same because it isn't part at all related to this, even though they share a client ID up on top. That's about it. So there'll be like these trees of tokens where this refresh token may be issuing a new access token, and then that would get a new refresh token down the chain like that. Which also means if you invalidated this refresh token, this one would not be affected. So if you like revoked access to this session, essentially, this chain wouldn't be affected. That's typically how it's done. You could, however, decide that you operate on the client ID as a whole, where if you want to invalidate a refresh token that belongs to one client ID, anything relating to that client ID would be revoked as well, which is more drastic, right? But that's another reason that that's like the more secure, more safe option, because it would invalidate all tabs at the same time. But that's why you would want to use a different client ID for your phone app, for example, because invalidating the session on the browser should not affect your session on the phone. Those should be different client IDs.
I wonder if that might be a way to address the challenge of parallelism with refresh token rotation.
True. Yeah, of the different components all doing their own flow to get their own token chains.
Yeah, might introduce a lot of I don't know, additional activity, for lack of a better word, but might be a way to manage the challenge with parallelism.
It's definitely a challenge, but for the like simple architectures where there's only one thread of the app, then refresh token rotation is very easy to manage. It's very easy to do, and it's more secure doing it that way. So we're thinking now that the recommendation, it might change to a should instead of a must for the refresh token rotation, just because there are these difficult situations that are challenging to overcome, and you may need to bend that rule. And if you're doing everything else the best you can, then, you know, as long as you know what you're doing, it's okay to bend some of the rules, I guess.
Yeah.
Because otherwise people are just going to ignore the advice anyway.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see how a company like Okta responds to that. Like, they could just go ahead and keep issuing, the same refresh token back and say, hey, we're shoulding it, but it'd be cool if that became like an option or something where you could say, hey, I want refresh token rotation.
Yeah, I would love to see that option available just as a checkbox, because if you know you're going to be building your app in a certain architecture, then you should be able to use that feature if you want.
Yeah. Cool. While we're on the topic, we have another refresh token related one.
Yeah, I mean, this is the challenge, right? Of if you're in a browser environment, where do you store any tokens? And the fact is, there just isn't a good solution right now. There's no perfect answer. We need browsers to actually build in better APIs for storing these kinds of sensitive things. So the best you can do is store them in the APIs you have available, right? Like store them in local storage or whatever, which is not great, but there's not a lot you can do. I guess the one option you have, which requires re-architecture possibly, is to it's this pattern where there's a dynamic backend to your browser app. So in that case, what it means is that you can actually have your dynamic backend be the OAuth client, where your server code is doing the OAuth exchange, storing the refresh token there, never actually sending it to the browser. And then you use an HTTP only cookie between the browser and that component so that the tokens aren't in the browser. But again, that's an architectural decision, and it may not make sense for every situation. If you're trying to do something that's like more stateless than that, where you don't want to store things server side, you can mimic it by using encrypted cookies, server side encrypted cookies, where you then would have multiple backend servers running, and you can do that across multiple regions. But as long as they share the encryption key, they can decrypt the cookies. Whichever one the cookie sends to can decrypt the cookie, and the cookie would then be storing the refresh token in it, but encrypted. And that way, again, it's HTTP only, so JavaScript can't access it, encrypted so that even if something on your machine grabs that file, it's at least encrypted, so it can't extract the refresh token. And then your backend is the one that decrypts it and uses the refresh token. But yeah, it's not there's no good solution.
especially with browsers. And I think that's at least among the reasons why Okta and other providers choose not to send refresh tokens down to the browser. It's kind of bad enough that, your options are limited for storing access tokens, but when you have something like an unlimited refresh token, you especially don't want that kicking around your browser.
Yep, definitely. Let's see
We have
what
one
else.
about server to server communication. Does OIDC or OAuth talk about server to server communication? There's a flow for that.
There sure is. OIDC really doesn't have anything to do with that because OIDC is always about like identifying who the user is. So if there is no user,
Good
you're probably
point.
not going to be in OIDC land. But OAuth certainly does because OAuth is not about users necessarily. It's about apps getting access to APIs. And there is a grant for that. It's called the Client Credentials Grant. And it's probably the simplest because it's effectively just the app's password. The app just goes and says, hey, I need an access token. Here's my password. And it gets one.
Yeah, the OAuth client credentials flow is a good place to look if there's no human interaction at all. But great point about OIDC. I think they get conflated sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Here's a good one. The current best practice says no access tokens in the query string. However, this can have significant impact on performance because of CORS pre-flights triggered by using a custom header. It's true. There's not a lot of good workarounds because, you're going to need support CORS, which will have that pre-flight. Isn't that pre-flight cached eventually though? I assume it's not
Yeah,
checked on every request.
the pre-flight is as small as a head request, so you're not passing a lot of content, and it should be like a once per session kind of thing. Like once you get back the right response from the server that satisfies the pre-flight, it shouldn't keep making those options requests.
Yeah, at
So it's
least for that
relatively
same
lightweight, but it does
host name.
add, yeah, it does add an initial request for sure.
Yeah. The only other option again is involves re-architecting things where you make your single page app talk to something on the same domain as it, so there isn't a CORS issue, and the that way your single page app talks directly back to the same host name, no CORS, pre-flight, and then your backend would proxy it out to the real API. That's the only real workaround, I guess. If you have a system with lots of endpoints, lots of different host names, then it would slow down. Yeah, it's an architecture choice to do it that way, of having your single page app talk directly to lots of different host names versus proxying them all through a single host name.
Yeah, and just to be clear on that question, it's not so much the endpoints as it is the host names.
Right.
Because
Yeah.
once you've gotten the CORS response from back from the host from that initial request, it shouldn't be making additional ones.
Yep. Yeah. Well, we're almost at the top of the hour. Any closing thoughts or other questions?
When's the next meeting of the working group to well, I guess you could take up any kind of question, but I guess specifically about 2.1.
Yeah. The we don't have a next official meeting scheduled, so there's just the ongoing like office hour calls that are happening. And the next IETF meeting is in November, which was going to be in Bangkok. And I don't think it's going to happen there, but I also haven't seen any official announcements yet. So that may end up being, it is officially online now. That was announced recently. So we are probably going to do the same thing we did in the previous one, which is schedule our own meetings, OAuth meetings across a couple of weeks in November.
Got it.
This is a good question. With OAuth 2.1, will there be something like the next OIDC version? So this is definitely a tricky question because, again, one of the goals of OAuth 2.1 is that we're not actually changing anything that doesn't already exist. So OAuth 2.1 is a consolidation with a label. So if you are doing things the best way right now, that you will be already set up, you will already be building OAuth 2.1. Like that is supporting OAuth 2.1. That said, OpenID Connect does extend OAuth core and doesn't necessarily require that you do all of the OAuth best practices. So it is sort of possible to do OIDC but not be OAuth 2.1 compliant because you may just be doing, following the old OAuth advice that OIDC extended. It's also possible to be building an OIDC compliant system and also be OAuth 2.1 compliant because we're designing it that way. So if you're using OIDC and you're doing OAuth the best way, you're fine. You don't need to change anything. As for whether OIDC publishes another version explicitly that extends OAuth 2.1 as opposed to 2.0, that hasn't really been talked about yet. But I'm also not tuned into all the OIDC groups conversations because it is a different organization, and I'm barely able to keep up on one mailing list, much less two. So I wouldn't be surprised if at some point that does happen, but I wouldn't expect to see that until well after 2.1 is finished. But again, it's not like it's required. Like OIDC doesn't need to do that because it is entirely possible to add all the OIDC stuff on top of OAuth 2.1. Like you don't need to redo how you're doing your OIDC things.
It's a good question, and I haven't really thought about this before. Maybe but I'm just curious. Does their working group ever release anything like BCP type things? Like, is it perfectly fine with OIDC to use the implicit flow, for instance?
That's a good question. Now, where does that get published? So they do have, I don't know if they have BCP, the equivalent of BCPs. Now I'm actually curious.
Yeah.
They do publish a lot of documents, and there's a lot of sub-organizations under the OpenID Foundation, which is like the financial API working group.
Yeah.
Where actually that's where a lot of the security BCP came from. So there's a lot of these sort of profiles of OpenID Connect that are more restricted and more secure, that I don't want to say extend it, but like narrow down, like restrict it so that you can only do a certain way. So like in the financial API working group, that has a document that says, don't use the implicit flow, like only use this particular flow, right?
Right.
I don't know if I don't know about whether that bubbles up to like OIDC as a whole as to when those specs get updated.
Might be something useful or interesting to report back on for our next one in 2 weeks. I'll do a little digging and see what kind of documents or updates they produce.
Yeah, good idea. Yeah, it's an interesting one. But again, I wouldn't worry too much about whether or not you're compliant with 2.1 or anything like that, or having to rebuild everything, because we're really just trying to save people the trouble in the future about learning what the best way to do OAuth is by starting with a new baseline instead of having to read 10 years of specs.
And for that, we thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's go ahead and wrap it up there. It's a good conversation. Lots of interesting stuff happening in this world all the time. Thanks all for joining. I hope it looks like we had at least Lee watching us on Twitch. So we'll see if we get more people on Twitch next time. But good to see everybody. Thank you all for joining. Bring your questions. We'll be back here in 2 weeks. You can find the next dates of these on oktadev.events, which is there. And also the workshops that I'm doing are always posted there. So I have a series of them coming up next week. If you want to do a deep dive on OAuth and OpenID Connect, they're all free. Go ahead and sign up for the next ones in a time zone that makes sense for you. I'm doing them across West Coast, East Coast, and Australia time zones next week. So it'll be a busy week. So go check it out. And those are always fun. We do a lot of Q&A in those as well, and walk through actually building out some apps and things like that. All right. Thank you all for watching.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
See you next time.